It was a decision that would haunt 3 young lives forever. A mother stood silently in the doorway of her children's room, her heart as cold as the lifeless air around her. Zion, the eldest twin, lay in his bed with his sister Zara close by, their innocent faces calm in sleep. Amari, their younger brother, curled tightly under his blanket, still sucking his thumb. She watched them for what she knew would be the last time. No tears would fall from her eyes. No lingering glance of regret. This was her moment of freedom. A moment she had been waiting for. Without a word, she packed a bag, grabbed her keys, and walked out of the apartment. She had already made plans. The rent for the next 3 years was paid, groceries would be delivered every week, and all they had to do was stay out of sight. They didn't need her. She didn't need them. It was simple, really. She wasn't abandoning them out of hatred, she was just moving on. She didn't want to be a mother anymore. The reality of it had grown too heavy for her to bear. It wasn't her fault. It never was. The choices she made, the life she lived, they all led to this moment. This is the freedom she longed for. But as she locked the door behind her, leaving the apartment in silence, a flicker of something briefly flashed across her mind. A trace of guilt, or perhaps just a brief moment of doubt. She heard Amari's small voice, barely audible as he mumbled in his sleep, "Mama, Mama, where?" It was the last time she would ever hear his innocent call. She walked away. The apartment door shut behind her, and the sound seemed to echo in her soul. For 3 years, no one would question her decision. For 3 years, she would live her life, leaving her children to struggle, to survive with no one to care. The system would keep them alive just barely, but no one would notice the broken lives behind that door. It would be just another statistic, another forgotten story. The children would wait. They would wait for a mother who never came back. To understand how a mother could abandon her children for years, we need to look at the woman behind the decision, Jasmine Moore. She wasn't always the detached, cold woman who could walk away from her children. No, once she had dreams. Once she had a family that loved her. But somewhere along the way, those dreams faded and Jasmine became someone else. Someone who lived in constant pursuit of freedom without the weight of responsibility holding her back. Jasmine was born in Cleveland, Ohio, into a middle-class family with a modest but loving upbringing. Her parents, Helen and Marcus Moore, worked hard to provide for her and her 2 younger brothers. The Moores weren't rich by any means, but they always made sure Jasmine had what she needed: private school, music lessons, family vacations. She grew up in a home where love wasn't a question. It was assumed, felt in every hug, every meal, every moment they spent together. Security, both emotional and financial, was the foundation of her early life. Her parents believed in her potential and hoped she would grow up to achieve something great, just like they had. However, as Jasmine entered her teenage years, a deep discontent began to brew within her. Her family, her well-meaning parents, seemed to be the very thing that suffocated her dreams. Jasmine was restless, yearning for something more. She wanted to be seen, to be admired. She wanted attention, and she learned early that her looks could get her exactly what she wanted. By the age of 16, Jasmine had already started dating older men who could take her to fancy dinners, who could offer her a lifestyle far beyond what her family could afford. It wasn't long before she dropped out of high school, convinced that the world beyond her small town held endless possibilities. At 18, Jasmine moved to Miami, the city of lights, glitz, and glamour. She quickly found herself in the thick of the party scene, hopping from one man to another, enjoying the attention that came with her beauty. But something was always missing. No matter how many men she dated, how many parties she attended, there was still a hollowness in her heart. She wasn't fulfilled. She wasn't loved the way she craved. That's when she met Eli Carter, a charming 24-year-old nightclub promoter who swept her off her feet. He wasn't rich, but he promised her something more: excitement, passion, a life without boundaries. She quickly became his constant companion, living in the moment, surrounded by luxury and adventure. By the time Jasmine was 20, she was pregnant. The news hit her like a wave, knocking her off balance. Eli was thrilled, but Jasmine was far from ready to be a mother. She wasn't even sure she wanted to be one. The thought of a child, a living, breathing responsibility, terrified her. At first, Jasmine convinced herself that Eli's excitement would be enough to keep her grounded. But when her daughter Ariana was born, the reality of motherhood hit her hard. Every late-night feed, every diaper change, every cry from her newborn felt like a burden. The life she had envisioned, carefree and fun, seemed further away than ever. Jasmine thought that by having a baby, Eli would marry her, settle down, and make everything right. But the opposite happened. As Ariana grew older, Eli distanced himself more and more. Jasmine watched as he checked out emotionally, overwhelmed by the responsibility. He started working longer hours, coming home later, and showing less interest in her or the baby. At the same time, Jasmine grew resentful. She blamed him for her predicament, but deep down she knew she wasn't prepared for the life she had created. So, when Eli walked out on them one night, leaving only a note behind, Jasmine felt a sick, twisted relief. She didn't know how to be a mother, and now she didn't have to be. Jasmine tried to make ends meet by using the system: government assistance, food stamps, and public housing. She learned the rules, figured out how to get by, and, most importantly, how to avoid scrutiny. For a while she was content. She could be free again, even if it meant using her daughter as a tool to get the resources she needed. She wasn't just a single mother. She was a woman in control of her situation. The people around her saw a young woman making it on her own, a survivor. But Jasmine knew better. She wasn't surviving, she was avoiding. Avoiding responsibility. Avoiding the life she didn't want. And most of all, avoiding the love and emotional connection she feared would tie her down. By the time Jasmine met Tyrone, a successful construction worker, she had learned how to hide her children, how to live a life that looked free to the outside world. Tyrone didn't want children, and Jasmine was fine with that. She kept Ariana out of sight when he was around, and when it was convenient, she left her with relatives or neighbors. The pattern was set. The same pattern that had defined Jasmine's entire life. As long as she didn't have to face the consequences of her decisions, she could keep pretending that everything was fine. But as time passed, Jasmine's need for freedom grew stronger, and the responsibilities of motherhood became more of a hindrance than a joy. She began to dream of a life without the constant tug of responsibility, a life where she could truly be herself, without a child to care for, without anyone needing her. It was then that she made a decision. A decision that would change everything. For Zion, Zara, and Amari, life had become a constant series of questions with no answers. It started as any other normal day, with their mother's absence being a usual part of their lives. But on that day things felt different. The apartment felt eerily quiet, and when Zion, the eldest twin, woke up to find his mother's belongings gone, he didn't understand what it meant. He had grown used to waking up to her absence, to the times when she came home late, smelling like perfume and alcohol, her eyes distant and unfocused. He learned early on how to take care of his younger sister and brother, how to make breakfast and clean up the mess she left behind. But this was something new. This wasn't just another night gone by. Something had shifted in the air, something unspoken and unsettling. The note she left behind seemed to confirm his worst fears. Zion stared at the words, the ink barely legible. Gone to handle some business. Food coming every Tuesday. Rent paid. Utilities paid. Don't answer the door for nobody. Don't go outside. Back soon. He knew better than to call for her or search for her. His mother had disappeared before, only to return with stories of late-night adventures or new men in her life. But this time he didn't feel relief. He felt fear. A cold wave washed over him as he looked over at Zara, still fast asleep, and at Amari, who had yet to fully grasp the reality of their situation. The first few days passed slowly. The children went about their routine, waiting for the familiar sound of their mother's key in the door, waiting for the smell of her perfume, the promise that she would return, even if it was always an empty one. Zion kept everything together as he had always done. He made sure Zara and Amari were fed. He turned the TV on to drown out the silence in the apartment. But the food supply was dwindling, and he had to make do with the leftovers, counting the days until the next delivery. He rationed what they had, teaching his younger siblings how to stretch every meal. Yet there was still that nagging feeling in his gut, that something was horribly wrong. Their mother had always returned, eventually, but this time felt different. By the third day, the fear that had taken root began to bloom into something deeper. Zion couldn't remember the last time he had heard from her, the last time she had even checked in. The old landline they had barely worked, and it seemed as though they had fallen off the map, forgotten. There was no communication, no sign of life from her. And still, the food kept coming. Once a week, every Tuesday. Just enough to keep them alive, just enough to avoid the suspicion of neighbors or social services. Zion's mind raced, thinking about what would happen when the food ran out, when the rent stopped being paid. How long could they survive like this? Amari, who was still young and innocent, continued to ask for his mother, calling her name at night, hoping she would come home. He didn't understand. He didn't understand why she wasn't there to comfort him when he had nightmares, or why she didn't come home after telling them she was just handling business. But Zion could see it in Amari's eyes, the confusion, the sadness, the longing for something he couldn't grasp. Zion tried to comfort him the best he could, though it tore him apart inside to know he couldn't give his brother the love and reassurance he so desperately needed. Zara, who was closer to Zion than anyone else, began to withdraw. She stopped asking about their mother, stopped trying to play with Amari, and spent most of her time staring out the window. Zion could see the change in her. She was no longer the playful, talkative child she had once been. Instead, she had become like a ghost, fading into the background, waiting for something to shift, for something to happen. But nothing did. The days turned into weeks, and the apartment began to show signs of neglect. The toilet was clogged and no one bothered to fix it. Zion had always been the one to clean up, but he was only 12. He couldn't take care of everything. The apartment began to smell, the smell of dirty clothes, rotting food, and unwashed bodies. It wasn't just the mess that bothered Zion, it was the silence that seemed to fill the space. The noise, the laughter, the presence of a mother, those had all vanished. It was just the three of them now, isolated in a place that once felt like a home, but now felt more like a prison. The lack of food took its toll. Zion had learned early on how to stretch a meal, but the basic survival foods they had been receiving, canned ravioli, instant ramen, crackers, were not enough. They weren't nutritious. They didn't keep the children healthy. Zion could see it in Zara's skin, which had become pale and dull. Amari's weight was dropping and he became more and more sluggish, barely able to get out of bed in the morning. Zion began to feel like he was losing control. He couldn't fix the plumbing, he couldn't provide enough food, and he certainly couldn't make their mother come back. He felt like the weight of the world was on his shoulders. He was just a child, but he had to play the role of an adult. The burden was breaking him little by little. By the time the third month came around, Zion and Zara had lost most of their energy. They weren't playing games anymore. They weren't laughing, talking, or even fighting. They were just surviving. And even Amari, who had once been so full of life, had become quieter, more withdrawn. They had grown accustomed to the silence, to the quiet, to the empty apartment. But the worst was yet to come. It had been 3 months since the children's mother, Jasmine, had walked out of their lives, leaving them to fend for themselves in that small, deteriorating apartment. Life had become a grim routine of survival, with Zion at just 12, doing his best to care for his siblings. But something inside him told him that they couldn't keep living like this. There were no phone calls from their mother, no knocks at the door from social workers, and no sign of life outside their small world. They had disappeared into the void of neglect, invisible to everyone. It wasn't until a few weeks after the third month had passed that someone finally took notice. Michelle Rodriguez had just moved into apartment 4C, directly next to 4B, where the 3 children were holed up in isolation. At first, she didn't think much of the strange noises she heard through the thin walls, shuffling, dragging sounds that echoed late at night, often around the time her 2-year-old daughter Maria would wake up from nightmares. Michelle had been a mother long enough to recognize the sounds of distress in children. Yet she told herself it was probably nothing. Perhaps it was just the building settling or rats running through the walls. But the noises didn't stop. Night after night there was something more sinister about them, something unsettling. Curious, Michelle began to pay closer attention. During the day there was never any sign of life from the apartment next door. The windows were often covered with thick blankets, preventing any light from spilling into the hallway. No one came or went. No sounds of laughter, no television, no voices of children playing. At first, Michelle figured it was a quiet family, but the longer she stayed, the more she realized something was terribly wrong. She asked around the building, but no one seemed to know much about the tenants of 4B. The neighbors had vague memories of seeing a woman, Jasmine Moore, and occasionally her children, but it had been months since anyone had heard or seen them. A couple of neighbors mentioned seeing Jasmine leave, but no one had noticed her absence, or if they had shrugged it off. It wasn't unusual for people to come and go, especially in a place like this. But for Michelle, something wasn't right. Her instincts as a mother wouldn't allow her to ignore it. So one night, when the sounds became unbearable, she decided to act. It was 2 a.m. and she could hear the muffled sobs again, children crying, but in a way that seemed almost primal. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's voice answered. I think there are children in the apartment next to mine. I haven't seen an adult there in weeks, but I keep hearing them crying. They're in distress. I think they need help. The dispatcher assured her they would send someone to check, but as Michelle hung up, she couldn't shake the feeling of dread settling in her chest. The children, whoever they were trapped. They had been forgotten, but now someone had finally noticed. They had a chance at being seen again. Within the hour, police officers Maria Santos and James Wright arrived at the apartment complex. They knocked on the door of 4B, but there was no answer. They knocked again, this time louder. "Hello? Miami Police?" Officer Santos called out. "We just want to make sure everyone's okay. Can you open the door?" A long silence passed. Then a faint sound came from behind the door. A soft, frightened voice, barely audible, called out, "Go away." The voice was small, childish, and trembling. Officer Santos exchanged a glance with Officer Wright. This was no ordinary call. The child sounded scared, and the officers could sense the gravity of the situation. They pressed on, their voices firm but gentle, trying to reassure the child that they were there to help. "We're here to make sure you're okay. Can you open the door?" Officer Wright asked. The response was a hesitant, "Mama said never open the door for nobody." "Sweetie, we're not here to hurt you. We're the police. We just need to make sure you're okay. Can you tell us your name?" Another long pause followed before the voice answered softly, "Zion." The officers could hear the fear in Zion's voice, and with that, they knew they had to break through. They called for backup, realizing that the children inside this apartment were in grave danger, and that they couldn't leave until they were certain they were safe. The apartment was tense with anticipation as the officers stood at the door of 4B. Officer Santos knocked one final time, her patience wearing thin. "Miami Police, we need to speak with you. Please open the door," she called out. This time the sound of shuffling inside reached their ears. A moment later, a young boy, Zion, appeared in the cracked doorway. His appearance was shocking. His once bright eyes were now dull, hollow from malnutrition and fear. His clothes, ragged and torn, hung loosely on his skeletal frame. He looked much younger than his age, as if time had aged him far beyond his 14 years. Zion's eyes locked onto the officers as he cautiously opened the door just wide enough to speak. "Mama's not here," he whispered, his voice shaky. "She's been gone. I don't know for how long." Officer Wright crouched down to his level, trying to make him feel safe. "Zion, we're here to help you. Can you tell us what's been happening? Where's your mom?" Zion paused, looking away as if trying to gather the courage to speak. "She left. Said she was going to handle some business. She told me to take care of my brother and sister. The food's coming every week. But," he trailed off, his words faltering as he broke down, "she didn't come back. And now, it's been so long. I don't know what to do. I tried to keep them safe, but I couldn't. I couldn't make it stop." The officers exchanged a somber glance. They knew this wasn't just a case of abandonment, it was neglect on a horrific scale. Inside, they could hear the muffled sounds of Zara and Amari, still hidden in the shadows of the apartment. As they entered, the stench of decay hit them hard. The apartment was a disaster. Unwashed dishes piled up in every corner, food containers filled with mold, and the unmistakable smell of human waste where the toilet had stopped working long ago. Zion led the officers into the small living room, where Zara sat huddled in the corner, her eyes wide but empty, staring at nothing. Amari was curled up next to her, clutching a worn, stuffed animal. His small face was covered in dirt and tears. The sight of the children, all underfed and broken, sent a jolt through Officer Santos's chest. It was clear that this had been going on for far too long. "Zion, we need to take you and your siblings to a safe place, okay?" Officer Santos said gently, her heart breaking for them. "You're not in trouble. We're going to take care of you now." Zion nodded silently, tears welling up in his eyes, but he said nothing more. He had already said everything he could, even though his silence spoke volumes. Back in the hallway, Officer Wright made a quick decision. He picked up the phone and called for immediate backup. "We need a welfare check and we need an ambulance here now. The kids are in bad shape." But as they waited for the backup to arrive, Officer Santos couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in her gut. Who had done this? Who had allowed these children to suffer in such a horrible way? Her mind raced as she prepared to face the woman who had left them to rot in a neglected apartment. Jasmine Moore had abandoned her children for far too long, and now she would face the consequences of her cruelty. The next call went out, this time to Detective Sarah Martinez. The manhunt for Jasmine Moore had begun, and there would be no place for her to hide. Section 6. Conclusion and reflection. The following days were filled with media coverage and intense scrutiny. Jasmine Moore's actions, leaving her children to rot in a neglected apartment, shocked the community and the country. But for Zion, Zara, and Amari, the worst was over. They were placed in a safe environment, surrounded by experienced foster parents who would care for them the way they had always deserved. The physical damage to their bodies was evident. Weight loss, rashes, unkempt hair, but it was the emotional scars that would take far longer to heal. In the hospital, Zion clung to his sister Zara, afraid to let go, as if the bond they shared was the only thing that could keep him grounded. Amari, though quieter, found comfort in his new surroundings, though the trauma he had experienced in those long months left a shadow over his once carefree nature. They would never be the same children they were before their mother left them, but at least they had a chance to rebuild their lives. As for Jasmine, the arrest was just the beginning of her downfall. When Detective Martinez tracked her down in Coral Springs, living her lavish life with no regard for the children she had abandoned, it became clear that this wasn't a case of an unfortunate mistake. Jasmine had carefully orchestrated her children's suffering, willing to let them deteriorate while she lived a life of luxury with her new boyfriend. The charges against her were harsh, but they were deserved. At trial, Jasmine claimed she had provided for them, citing the weekly deliveries and the automatic rent payments as proof that she hadn't abandoned them entirely. But the judge saw through her lies, and in a landmark decision, Jasmine was sentenced to 45 years in prison, with no possibility of parole for 25 years. It was a small victory for the children, but it could never undo the damage she had caused. While Jasmine rotted behind bars, Zion, Zara, and Amari slowly began to recover. They were placed with the Johnson family, who had years of experience in fostering children in need. It wasn't easy for them, but they finally had the stability and love they had been deprived of for so long. As they learned to trust again, they also learned that there were people in the world who cared about them. The case of Jasmine Moore was a haunting reminder that the systems meant to protect children often fail. But it was also a wake-up call. The community failed to see the signs. No one had noticed these children in pain. It's easy to overlook the quiet ones, but those who seem invisible often need our help the most.